All right, I want to thank everybody for being here and welcome you this afternoon to our program on elections in Minnesota. This is presented by the League of Women Voters Minnesota, but we are pretty pleased to have with us two leaders in our state on elections, both David Maeda and Paul Linnell from the Minnesota Secretary of State's office. The topic today is 2022 elections. Will they be fair, accurate, and secure? We thought it was important to hear from those who are most closely involved with elections in Minnesota and how they function and how they will be held this year. Just by way of introduction, real briefly, David Maeda has been the director of elections for Minnesota since January 2019. Before that, he had been the Minnetonka city clerk from 2007 to 2019. Through that position, David led the introduction of a variety of voting technologies, including electronic poll books, which those of us who are election judges have become very familiar with. And I know that from my experience with redistricting, he's a really adept and strategic at the whole process of redrawing precinct boundaries to manage how ballots are drawn and make things easier for both election workers and for voters. He's a 1987 graduate of McAllister College. And in addition to having been the Minnetonka City Clerk, he previously was the chair of the Minnesota Council on Asia Pacific Minnesotans and former chair of the League of Minnesota Cities Election Task Force, and had worked in the Hennepin County Election Office. Paul Linnell, who is the Deputy Director of Elections for Minnesota, is previously the elections manager for Anoka County. So some of you may know him from that past experience as well. So what I will offer is just our thanks for them being here today and this important topic. What we ask you all to do is, as you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Sam Stroikens is here supporting, helping to facilitate those questions and make sure we have them. What we'd like to do is once David and Paul are done with their discussions, we will then open up for questions and have those brought forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to David and Paul for the program.
Thank you, Paul. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really great to see so many people attending this because this is a very important topic, of course, and we're happy to try to provide as much accurate information for you as we can, and that's what this presentation is about. Our first few slides here are, you just actually covered our introductions. The one thing I'll mention about my background is I think I'm one of two people in our state that have worked at the city, the county, and now at the state level in elections administration. The other being the elections manager in Dakota County. But it's really given me the big picture and little picture view of Minnesota elections. I've worked with voters firsthand when I was the Minnetonka city clerk, election judges in Minnetonka. In Hennepin County, my focus was more on helping our cities and townships administer elections, and now at the state, I'm working with the 87 counties. I'll just mention the last bullet. So the elections team is a team of 18, 9 program election staff, and then we have 9 IT development staff that keep our voter registration system and our online tools up and running. It's not a huge team. You think about when you go get a driver's license, you can go get a driver's license from hundreds of locations in Minnesota. We have over 3 million voters registered to vote in Minnesota, so 18 of us leading 3 million voters. That's not a big office, but we do our best to lead the state in elections. And I'll turn it over to Paul to introduce himself.
All right, thanks, David. Yeah, I'm excited to have recently joined the team here at the Secretary of State's office. As Paul mentioned on the front end, I joined here in August, coming over from Anoka County, where I was the elections manager there and had the good fortune of working with an excellent group of election staff at the county, as well as city clerks and election judges there that have been fantastic. And was fortunate in the picture there to have received our office the Friend of the League Award from the Anoka Blaine Coon Rapids League of Women Voters in 2021 for our work during the 2020 elections. So I know and appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today and know of all the great work that you all have been doing. So looking forward to the discussion today.
So unfortunately, as we are fast approaching the 2022 state general election, we still aren't able to completely focus on our work that we need to do for 2022 because we're still dealing with some of the after effects of 2020. And so I thought I'd walk a little bit of what's occurred since November 2020. The big message we should have all taken from the 2020 election was what a remarkable job everyone in the state did in running a fair, secure, and safe election. Of course, we got hit with the pandemic beginning in March. It was historic in that we had to figure out how to run a safe election in a global pandemic. And so we worked with our 87 county partners. We worked with all our city and township and school district partners, the 30,000 election judges that worked the election in November of 2020 to pull off a great election. Minnesota led the nation in turnout again for the third consecutive year. We hit almost 80% of our eligible voters voted in 2020. And when you think about that, that's really remarkable. So the overwhelming message we all should be taking from the 2020 election was how great an election we were able to run safely and securely in 2020. Unfortunately, some of the messaging that has happened since the 2020 election has unfortunately called into question the integrity of the 2020 election. And so a lot of what we were trying to address in 2021 was this misinformation and disinformation about what actually occurred in the 2020 election. I'll note that the city of Minnetonka has odd-year city elections. So I was in touch with my former colleagues from Minnetonka, and they told me that 2021 election was even more difficult to administer than the 2020 election, given the anger and the mistrust from the 2020 election just escalated throughout the year. It was unfortunate that many of the election judges that I worked with during my dozens of years in Minnetonka decided 2020 was the last election they were going to work. It just got to be too difficult to be an election judge post 2020, which is really unfortunate, something I've kept my eye on in 2022 to make sure we don't have a shortage of poll workers. In November, I have not heard of any county that's concerned about that, so that's good. But there's been a lot of mistrust based on this misinformation and disinformation about our long-established processes and systems that ensure a fair and accurate election, and that's what we're going to present on today. The latest thing that our county partners are really struggling to deal with is an overwhelming number of data practices requests from the 2020 election. So there seems to be a concerted effort to make sure or make our county partners' lives more difficult by sending in multiple data practices requests asking for information from 2020. And of course, in Minnesota, data practices, if you get a data practices request as a government official, you're required to respond to that. And if you have the data, you're required to produce it for the person asking for the data. That's a great law. Unfortunately, it's being weaponized to make the lives of our county election administrators more difficult because they have to deal with all these requests for information while trying to stay focused in 2022. And Paul and I have really worked hard in trying to assist our counties in dealing with this overwhelming number of data practices requests. Transparency in our election process is critical, and that's a lot of what I've focused on since 2021, is making sure that each one of our steps that we have in place to make sure our elections are fair and secure are understood in as simple a manner as possible for anyone that's curious about how our elections are run in Minnesota. I thought I'd quickly go over this. So after every federal election, there's a group at MIT that evaluate the states on how they did in the federal election and in administering the federal election. So in 2020, Paul, if you want to go to the next slide, this nonpartisan, unbiased group ranked our election processes as second in the nation next to Vermont Unfortunately, I think it was the third consecutive federal election that we finished in second place. I think we finished second to Vermont in 2018. I think it was North Dakota that finished first in 2016. So one of my goals is to get to the top of this mountain, but our voting systems, our processes, our laws are ranked by this academic group, and they ranked us second in 2020 in the way we administered the election. Some of the things they look at are voter turnout. I mentioned our close to 80% turnout of eligible voters. That was 12% higher than the national average. Our voter registration rate, which looks at the number of eligible voters that are actually registered to vote, we again had a very high number. 91% is pretty remarkable. The next one, data completement. So every year or every odd year, we take a survey from the Elections Assistance Commission, and a lot of the data that we provide to the EAC for this EVES survey is used to determine where we fall on this performance index. I just completed the first part of it for this year. They asked for things like our voter registration laws, our absentee voting laws, just everything administrative that we do in elections. They ask for information so they can rate us on this index. And again, we rated very high for completing that survey. We also get ranked high for for voters' ability to register online via our website, and voters' ability to look up their registration status and the status of an absentee ballot on our website. This is a great assistance to voters in helping them get a ballot cast. And then you can see we had a very low registration AB issues rate in Minnesota, 1% compared to the national average of 5%. So I think that shows that our systems make our processes accessible while still having security involved to make sure that only eligible voters are the ones being allowed to vote. The voter registration rejection rate in Minnesota is incredibly low. Our counties do a great job in working with anybody who's having difficulties registering to vote to clear up any issues. As you can see, less than 1% have the registration actually rejected. The residual vote rate is looking at voters that don't just vote at the top of the ticket. So voters that didn't just vote for the presidential race in 2020, but voted the down ballot races. I'm not exactly sure what that percentage means, but we were less than half of the national average. So our voters tend to vote the entire ballot compared to the national average. We ranked high in our post-election audit. Paul will talk a little bit about that process later on in this presentation, but we do have a post-election audit process where random precincts are selected in every county, and certain races are hand counted to verify the machine counts. And this group ranked our audits as being very strong. I'll mention ERIC a little bit. So it's the Electronic Registration Information Center, which is a consortium of 34 states. So we share our voter registration data with the other members of ERIC. And then, so if somebody moves from Minnesota to Wisconsin, from Iowa to Minnesota, both states know that and are able to update their voter registration systems that not allow a person to be registered in both states. It's a very important consortium that we were allowed to join in 2014 by our legislature. And unfortunately, it's been a victim of a disinformation attack, which has accused ERIC of being funded by a partisan source, which is completely untrue. ERIC is fully funded by the member dues that the 34 member states pay. Me being a board member of ERIC, I get to actually see a financial audit of the organization every year. So it's completely untrue that this organization is somehow linked to a partisan organization. And so our continued membership of ERIC, I think, is very important, and we get ranked higher in the index because we are a member of ERIC. And then some of the things we get that lowered our score a little bit were the three things in red here. So we had a higher number of unreturned mail ballots in 2020 than the national average. I did talk to the professor that leads the effort in developing this index to ask him the question. I know in 2020, several of our counties indicated to me that they had mailed out an absentee ballot to a voter. The voter decided they didn't trust either the USPS in delivering the ballot back to the county, or they simply didn't they wanted to see their ballot counted at the county. And so they took their mailed AB ballot and brought it into their county and then voted in person at their county. That would go to this number. And I think that's why our number is a little bit higher than the national average. Again, we have things in place to make sure that a voter doesn't get to vote two different ballots. And so that's, and Paul will cover some of that later in the presentation. Our disability access was a little bit lower than the national average. I'm not sure exactly what the 0.12 PP means, but this is something I've worked on hard in the last 2 years, 2021 and 2022. We actually had a meeting of our Disability Advisory Council. The first meeting that group has been able to get together since March of 2020, basically. And we've implemented some things that hopefully have removed some barriers for people with disabilities in being able to cast a ballot. And then UACAV is the federal program. It's the Uniformed Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act. It's the federal program that allows our voters in the military and overseas to vote an absentee ballot. We had a higher than the national average rejection of these ballots. I think a lot of that is our state does not allow a military or overseas voter to return their ballot electronically. The counties can email them the ballots, but the physical ballot has to be mailed back in the physical mail. And this leads, especially in 2020, where the foreign post offices, there was various states of if they were open, how long it was taking to deliver mail. So I think that's an ongoing challenge that we're continuing to look for ways to make sure that those of Minnesota voters living overseas or serving in the military are able to get a vote cast.
All right, thanks, David. So we'll just maybe take a brief look here at what's coming up on the 2022 ballot before diving into some of the ways that we know our voting system here in Minnesota is secure. So we have a very full ballot this year. 2022 is, as we all know, a redistricting year. So the state court redistricting panel in February released the updated congressional and state legislative lines. As a result of that redistricting, all state offices will be on the ballot this year. So it'll be, as David talked about, the commitment of Minnesotans to fill out their entire ballot. It might take a little bit longer than a usual year to get all the way from front to back. Another thing to keep in mind, and many of you may have received those redistricting postcards letting you know of what your updated districts are. You may find yourself with a different representative running for office this time around, a lot of retirements on the state side, as well as some redrawn lines where different areas were potentially pushed into different districts. One of the other points that we've been mindful of is reminding voters that your polling places may have changed. So the tools that are on the mnvotes.gov site, you can use those to look up your polling place, type in your address and see where your polling place is, as well as to view your sample ballot and see which contests are going to be on your ballot. So voting season is underway. Absentee voting started on Friday, September 23rd, and that will continue right up until Election Day. So whether you choose to vote early by mail, vote early in person, or vote on Election Day, start thinking about it, make your plan to make sure you can get your ballot in on or before Election Day. So take a look. The screen here shows a range of the voting equipment that you may have seen in use in Minnesota. We have 4 different voting equipment vendors that are certified for use in the state. 3 of them that have vote counting equipment. So those vendors are Dominion, Hart, and then ES&S, which is used by a majority of the counties across the state. And then 1 additional vendor, Democracy Live, which has the Omni Ballot tablet, which is a newer assistive voting device. Those assistive voting devices are also required to be in use in all polling places on Election Day, as well as for absentee voting for voters with disabilities. So a kind of basic fundamental question of why is it that we even use voting equipment in the first place? Why don't we hand count the ballots instead, so we know we've got eyes on all the ballots? And I think a simple answer to that, and the most important answer, is it's more accurate than hand counting. I think just about all of us would trust a calculator to do complex math than they would to tabulate it in our heads. And so we know that the error rates from these machines are microscopic, and they're incredibly accurate to get the results on the ballots and compared to the process that's required in doing that counting by hand. There's also extensive testing, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide, but we're able to test that equipment, and the counties and cities can test it and are required to prior to every election to ensure that it's working correctly. It's not one of those things you can do to pre-test your ability to hand count prior to undertaking that activity. The voting equipment also allows voters to correct mistakes. So if there's an overvote on a certain contest, or I know with the recently completed primary in August, where voters will on occasion cross over and vote for candidates in multiple party columns on the front of the ballot, the tabulators at the polling place will catch that and give the voter the opportunity to make a correction on their ballot that they otherwise would not be able to do if they were just inserting it into a ballot box to be hand counted later. And then, of course, we would always emphasize the importance of accuracy at the forefront as more important than speed. But to have results as they come in on election night from the vote counting equipment is really a great benefit of having voting equipment in place, and one that we would not be able to get in the event that we were to do hand counting for a state general election. And I know David's looked at some numbers before, and I think in most cases, ballots across the state will have 30 to 40 contests on those ballots. Based on the state laws that are in place for hand counting, each of those ballots would need to be counted separately for every contest that's on the ballot. So for a precinct, some of the precincts that are on the larger side in the state, 3,000 registered voters, if there's that many votes cast, we're looking at over 1 million ballots that would need to be counted in a hand counting scenario. So it's really not practical to get results any sooner than weeks after election day if we were doing that by hand. So with the voting equipment, how do we know that we can trust the voting equipment that's in use in Minnesota? So the first step in the process is through a federal certification. So federal testing labs are conducting thorough testing of any voting equipment that's to be used in the state. That's all the way down to the source code. That testing must be completed and certified before it's ever brought to the Office of the Secretary of State for our own state certification. Once it completes that federal certification, though, we do have the federal test lab reports that are reviewed by our office, and then we undertake our own separate testing process here at the state. So every voting equipment system must demonstrate that it meets all of the requirements in Minnesota election law. And this involves feeding through hundreds of ballots and making sure that the system, the equipment, can perform without error and meet all of those requirements in law. Then once the equipment is certified for use in the state, it's up to the counties to determine if they wish to purchase that voting equipment. Once they've got that equipment in place, they can't just roll it out and take our word for it. They are required by law to test every single piece of equipment prior to every election where it's used. So that was the case before the primary election, and that will be the case again ahead of this November's general election. So this involves sending through dozens, hundreds, thousands, in some cases, tens of thousands of ballots that must perform a completely errorless test in order for that equipment to be used on election day. And then select equipment is then subject to additional testing as part of a public accuracy test. So as the name suggests, and many of you I think may have attended these in the past, this is additional testing where ballots are fed through the voting equipment and must be compared with predetermined test results, and again have a 100% rate of accuracy in order to have a successful test. Once that that testing is completed, then we have the memory devices from that voting equipment sealed in, and seal numbers are recorded on official precinct certification forms by the clerks or the county. And then those seal numbers are verified again at the polling place on the morning of the election. So that's another step as far as the chain of custody and verifying that all of the information is accurate and correct there. Important points to note is, as David was talking about the after the 2020 election, we know there's no evidence showing that any voting machines were faulty or hacked or in any way compromised in the 2020 election or any other election that we've had here in Minnesota. We've had conspiracy theories regarding the machines, but not any evidence to back that up. So it's important to highlight these checks that are in place and all the ways we know that this equipment can be trusted. We also have the post-election audit that takes place after the election, so we'll get to that a little bit later in the presentation. Looking at the statewide voter registration system, so this is where all information is stored when voters register to vote, as well as how we process absentee ballot records in the state. At the top end, the important takeaway is that when someone registers to vote in Minnesota, they have to prove that they are who they say they are and that they live where they say they live. So there's laws and procedures in place that ensure the data in the statewide voter registration system is accurate and up to date. Some of the ways that this is done is through the sending of postal verification cards once voters are added into the system. So those are sent out to a voter's address, and if they come back, then the record is challenged in the system, and a process is in place for a second card to be sent. If that gets returned, then a voter's record is inactivated. A lot of times questions are received about deceased voters. What happens when a voter passes away? Those are removed based on notification from the Department of Health or Social Security Administration. Speaking from experience on the county side, I know we would often get phone calls from family members whose loved ones passed away, and more often than not, when we check that voter's record, it had already been inactivated based on the daily work that's taking place in the system. Records of those convicted of felonies are challenged based on notices from the court systems and departments of corrections. So those records will get challenged, and they're required to answer additional questions before being allowed to vote on election day. And then if an individual attempts to vote who's not eligible, that information is referred on to the county attorney's office for review and potential prosecution. Driver and Vehicle Services also provides lists of non-citizens that are here on temporary visas. So any voter record that's challenged for non-citizenship, again, has to complete a challenge process, and that information would be referred on for review if there's any question on citizenship status as well. As David mentioned, with the ERIC system, when voters move out of state, we receive updates to inactivate those records, as well as when voters move here into Minnesota. Similarly, the change of address process through the USPS helps us to keep that information updated as voters move within the state and out of state. We use the information in the statewide voter registration system to generate our rosters for election day, as well as what's noted here with the electronic poll books. Many counties across the state are using these electronic poll books. So this helps to keep the voter records up to date. As additional absentee ballots are cast, those voter records are updated and marked as having voted absentee to prevent situations of double voting. And then each year in January, there's a process that's known as annual list maintenance. So voters who have not voted or updated their registration in the last 4 years are inactivated. So they'll receive a notice that their registration has been inactivated if they haven't had activity, and that's helps to keep our rosters and information clean and up to date. And I will pass it back over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So after the 2016 election, the Department of Homeland Security designated elections as critical infrastructure. So we're on par with our nuclear power plants, our power grid, our food chain, in getting assistance from our federal intelligence agencies on keeping our election systems secure. A lot of the effort has been getting federal resources pushed down to our local partners, because anything that touches our system, we have to know is safe and secure, or as safe and secure as can be. Obviously, with computers, there's always concerns about being hacked or being a victim of malware. So we push out resources from our federal partners down to our local partners, as well as using them in our office. We also received some federal funding, and so we created a cyber navigator program. And what that means is we hired a person who's dedicated to dealing with cybersecurity related issues. When I posted the position, I thought there's no way anyone with enough experience is going to want to work for this office in this capacity, because we didn't have a lot of structure on what this program was going to be. Fortunately, everyone that I interviewed for the position was highly qualified, and we landed on Bill Ekblad, who came to us after years in the Navy. He served in the Middle East and Germany. He's done a terrific job in standing up this program. A lot of his focus has been on working with our county partners, making sure that the election staff at the county are working with their IT staff and vice versa, making sure there's not a disconnect between the people running an election and the people that are responsible for keeping the systems secure. So that's been a lot of Bill's efforts. Thankfully, this summer, we actually doubled the size of the program. We hired a second cyber navigator. And then I'm shifting some of Bill's focus, given what's gone on since 2020, from not just being a cyber security expert, but helping us deal with now physical security threats that are going on in the election sphere. One of the benefits of being critical infrastructure is we now get classified security briefings from Homeland Security and the FBI. Indeed, we had our latest last week at the FBI building in Brooklyn Center. So Bill and I attended, Secretary Simon and a few of our other staff were able to get some classified information from primarily Homeland Security last week on the state of elections. They have resources available to them that we wouldn't otherwise have available, and they make that available to us. We are aware of what's going on in the elections sphere as far as cyber and now physical security threats against elections. Unfortunately, the rise of dis, and malinformation since 2020 has gotten worse. This slide talks a little bit about what the difference is between those three categories. So misinformation is false information, but it's being spread or shared not in a way that's meant to be harmful. So if somebody shares something, or one of your friends sees something on Facebook and then posts it to all their friends, it might be false information, but they're not doing it maliciously. Disinformation is being spread to do harm. And then malinformation is information that is actually based on fact, but it's being used out of context. Unfortunately, in Minnesota, we've seen efforts in all three of these buckets. And the bottom sentence here explains the risks of misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. It serves to undermine confidence in our institutions and in activating and inspiring dangerous behaviors and violence. And I think we've seen that in our country. Unfortunately, we've seen it in Minnesota as well. One of the things that the Department of Justice, Homeland Security did was stand up a task force. So any election official, any of our election judges that receive a threat or harassment or intimidation that they think is over the top, we now can report that to this task force who's investigating these things. They're keeping an inventory, so the same individuals making over the top threats against multiple election officials, they're able to track those patterns. I don't think this has been something that I've heard a lot going on in Minnesota, although I have heard from some of our county officials that they've reported threats to this task force. In fact, one of our leading county officials told me yesterday that she was going to report something to this task force on a recent threat that she got. We did see some election judges in Ramsey County in 2020 that were followed home from their polling place on election night. I report that was before this task force stood up, but I did report that to the FBI, who did investigate that. So this world that we're working in, unfortunately, is a lot different than when Paul and I signed up to be election officials. Just the threat of physical security or threats against our physical security are increasing, and we are looking at ways on working with our federal partners to deal with that. One of the things we've really encouraged our county, cities, and townships in 2020, but again in 2022, is to make sure they're having regular meetings with their local law enforcement. So the county sheriffs, the police departments, making sure that the election officials meet with their local law enforcement. So if something comes up on November 8th at a polling place, law enforcement is working with the election official to deal with, or to coordinate on how they're going to deal with the incident going on at the polling place. Obviously, if it's something that requires immediate assistance, the election judges should call 911. But on the other side of the coin, we don't want law enforcement to go barging into a polling place to deal with a minor incident going on within the polling place. There's a line between intimidation of having a law enforcement present in a polling place versus actually dealing with something that's serious enough to have law enforcement in the polling place. So we've really encouraged our county partners and our city and townships to meet with law enforcement before November 8th. Election judges, we just recently sent out some information on de-escalation techniques. So if somebody comes into the polling place red hot and angry about something, our election judges have some tools to hopefully calm them down and get them into a reasonable state of behavior. We've encouraged our counties to include in their election judge training, de-escalation training for their election judges. Because again, since 2020, and what we saw in 2021, the anger out there has not decreased. So we really want our election judges feeling safe in doing their duties on election day. Then I mentioned this task force and reporting to the FBI and DOJ any serious threats against any election official or election judge in the state.
All right, thanks, David. So we won't spend a ton of time here going through the polling place election day activities, but certainly we've got a lot of information out there on how we know voting at the polling place on election day is accurate and secure. One of those is the audit that takes place throughout the day of election judges balancing the number of voter check-ins and the number of voters that are coming into the polling place versus the number of ballots that are cast at that polling place. So that balancing takes place and must be completed at the end of the night to ensure that those numbers are accurate. At the end of the night, those materials, the ballots, are returned back to City Hall and to the county auditor, and there's again sealing of the materials to ensure that those are secured and brought back with that chain of custody. In the days that follow election day, the election staff at the city and the county will closely review and proof those results and statistics, make sure that everything is accurate and correct. So the results that you see on election night that are posted here on the Secretary of State site, those remain unofficial until they are presented and certified by each of the canvassing boards. So that includes at the city, township, and school district level. They have canvassing boards to certify their local election results. The counties will certify the county and state offices at each county, and then finally, those abstracts from each of the 87 counties will be brought to the state canvassing board that will meet to certify the results of the election on the third Tuesday after election day. So those canvassing board meetings are all open to the public. So that's something, if you haven't attended in the past, it's open and part of this transparency that David is speaking to, that all of this is available and accessible for those that are interested. In the days and weeks following the election, the counties are also entering voting history and election day registration information. So that involves basically every voter record, whether it's an electronic poll book entry or it's the paper roster that you signed. Each of those voters, when you check in at the polling place or whether you vote absentee, you receive credit for voting. It's a voting history entry into your voter record. And that goes back to that annual list maintenance process. So as long as you're voting at least once every 4 years, your record is going to stay active and up to date. And as part of this process, if there are any voters that are challenged, as we mentioned previously, for being ineligible, if they've got a felony associated with their record, that's where information that suggests a violation may have taken place would be reviewed and passed along to the county attorney's office for further investigation.
I have a quick question for you, Paul.
Yeah.
First of all, so that would be if somebody were to vote absentee and in person, it would be checked on in that review process, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So with the absentee records being associated with a voter record in the statewide voter registration system, as soon as that absentee ballot is accepted by the absentee ballot board, which means it will be counted, that information is then added to the roster. So it happens with a number of records at the time that rosters are generated, and then counties are required to send supplemental reports on election day for any additional voters that vote absentee, to ensure that those rosters on election day stay up to date and that voters who've already cast a ballot are properly marked.
Great, thanks. And the second question is, you mentioned that if someone doesn't vote every 4 years, they have to re-register. Why is that? And what are they still in the system? Do they have to completely start the process over again?
So it is a requirement in state statute. So I think the legislative intention there was to make sure that if there are records that have become inactive or perhaps haven't been caught from like an out-of-state move, or are no longer active for whatever reason, that those are inactivated. It does not require anything more than just submitting a new registration. So that can be done online using a paper registration form, or through Department of Vehicle Services if they're updating anything there. So it would still link back. Their record is inactivated, but it would reconnect with that record once they re-register to vote.
Great. And another question just came in here. I'm going to ask it now, but you might cover it later. How long is the ballot stored by the county, and do they destroy them after a certain amount of time? What's the statute there?
Okay, it could be a couple of different things, I guess, with storage of ballots. If it's an absentee ballot prior to election day, those are stored in their envelopes as they're accepted up until 7 days prior to election day, when they can be opened and fed through tabulators prior to election day. If we're just talking about retention of ballots that have been voted in an election, those are stored securely at the time the polls are closed into ballot transfer cases, and are retained under a federal requirement and a state requirement for 22 months. So any voted ballots are kept for that period, and then destroyed pending any ongoing data requests or litigation. And hopefully I think that covers it. All right, so with the post-election review that we mentioned earlier, and I think a good way to think of this, because it is an audit of the machine count totals from the polling place. So if anyone is alleging that Minnesota doesn't have audits in place for our elections, that's absolutely not the case. We do have them. They are a hand count audit that is required to be conducted after every state general election to confirm that the results totals from the voting equipment are correct. Just like a number of the other processes we've mentioned earlier, this is also open to the public. So what takes place at the post-election audit is that the county canvassing boards for the general election will randomly select a number of precincts to be hand counted. The number varies by the number of registered voters in the county, but those precincts are not known in advance. They're selected at random at those canvassing board meetings. And then with the precincts that are selected, there's a hand count of select offices. So either the governor or the president, depending on the year, US representative, and then US senator, if that's on the ballot. As is listed here on the slide, there are the thresholds outlined for the acceptable variance between the machine count and the hand count. In a conversation a few weeks back with one of the national experts with elections audits, it was noted that Minnesota's standards are among the tightest in the nation. So I think we can take solace in that we have a very strong election audit in place to make sure that our voting equipment is working correctly and is counting ballots correctly. And in the history of the post-election review, which goes back, I think, close to 2 decades now, we have never had a situation where escalation has taken place, where additional review of precincts beyond the ones that have been selected is required. So I think that speaks to the strength of the voting equipment and the testing that takes place to know that we have confidence that it's working correctly prior to the election, and the audit on the back end verifies that indeed was the case for each election. The Secretary of State's office also conducts an additional review of the procedures in the randomly selected precincts. So it's four precincts across each of the 8 congressional districts. And so that involves our office meeting with the counties and the cities that are administering elections in those precincts to identify any issues that may have taken place and to help us to improve procedures and determine if there's any changes we can make to training and help to avoid any issues in future elections. So we also wanted to identify some of the resources that are in place, many of which you may already be aware of. And I know we'll also, I think, turn it over for the league to talk about some of the tools that you have on your side. But just a couple of the items that we wanted to highlight, the Trusted Info 2022 hashtag. I think this was first created in 2020 in partnership with the National Association of Secretaries of State to help promote trusted sources of information. So with this hashtag coming out from state elections offices, it helps voters to know and identify trusted information that is out there, particularly in the social media space. Also noting that our office has transitioned to the .gov domain. This, I think, falls into the area of what David was highlighting earlier about some of the Cyber Navigator priorities and some of the collaboration with on the federal side. One of the best ways to denote a trusted source of information is that .gov domain. So if for many years we've had the mnvotes.org in our heads, it's still taking some getting used to, but mnvotes.gov. Both of them will still work at this point, but we're pushing the .gov domain. We also, if you do see false information out there, anyone can help with reporting posts that have false information on Facebook or Twitter. I know the social media companies have in place resources to help to ensure that false election information is removed as soon as possible. So having additional sets of eyes on that is a big help. One of the pages that we wanted to highlight, and I'll see if I can pull it up here, is our facts versus fiction page. So the Minnesota elections facts, we have a number of resources on this page that will cover a lot of what we discussed here in the presentation today. As well as some of the other hypotheticals or kind of misinformation questions that you may have heard coming through different sources. So there's a number of the key facts there, as well as some of the fictions with explanations of what the reality is compared to some of the allegations that are out there. And there's a lot of information on different categories, including voter registration before Election Day, during Election Day. So certainly feel free to take a look at that page. And also if you have some ideas about other information that you think might be helpful to include on that page, feel free to send it our way. And then I know within the league content that we'll get to at the end here, some of we've hit on it a couple times, but having additional sets of eyes and ears at some of those publicly observable events, it's a great opportunity to engage and learn more about the process, and also be able to then speak with some authority as to the safeguards that are in place at your county and city level. So the public accuracy test that takes place during the last 2 weeks prior to Election Day, and that's required to be noticed. So you can contact your local office to see when your public accuracy test will be, your canvassing board meeting following the election, and then that post-election review that takes place after the election. And certainly, as I know many of you do each election cycle, and Paul was mentioning on the front end his work as a head judge in Washington County, that's an excellent way to get involved and to find out more about the election process and see firsthand at the polling place, and potentially opportunities on the absentee ballot board side or other ways to help out and see all the safeguards that are in place, all the people that are involved in making sure that the election is run and that it's run correctly. So I'll close with turning it over. This is actually, you'll be, I think, the first group to take a look at this recent brand new video that our communications department pulled together. It summarizes a lot of what we covered here today in a very easily digestible format, and I think we'll have it up on our website and available for distribution shortly. But if we've got time, it's only about a 4 or 5 minute video, so I thought I'd just let it run, and then we can turn it over to Paul and for any questions that you have.
Minnesota, we value hard work. We show up for each other, and we're committed to ensuring our neighbors, friends, and
Are you able to
family
hear that okay?
have freedom and opportunity. Here, we know the future of our communities is
Can't hear it anymore. I'm not sure what happened.
and we take pride in leading the nation in voter turnout year after year. So what makes our elections so special? There are 3 pillars that make Minnesota's elections stand out: accessibility, security, and accuracy. First, accessibility. We make it easy to register to vote before or even on election day. Using our online tool, you can register in just a couple of taps, and we offer many ways to vote. Any eligible voter can vote early in the 46 days before an election. They can mail their ballot or vote early in person at their county office. And of course, on election day, voters can head to their local polling place for the traditional voting experience. We have tools available for anyone who needs them, including support for those who are deaf, hard of hearing, or blind, and those whose first language isn't English. And in some cases, those who need to vote on election day but have medical challenges can vote from their car at their polling place. Next, security. When someone registers to vote, they must prove they are who they say they are and live where they say they live. During the registration process, local, county, and state elections officials check a voter's information using state and federal databases to ensure eligibility and prevent duplicate registrations. Elections equipment is certified by federal and state experts, and before every election, each piece of elections equipment is tested by local officials. Then it's tested again in front of the public. These tests make sure the machines that count the votes are functioning perfectly ahead of election day. Throughout the 46-day voting period, elections officials work to ensure only eligible voters cast ballots, and no one can vote more than once. And let's talk about local officials. They're our neighbors, friends, and family. They take an oath to administer elections fairly and free of influence. They are committed to democracy and the rule of law. Finally, accuracy. After election day is complete, local officials check their work. That's why we're sure every ballot cast comes from an eligible voter, and every ballot is counted correctly. County canvassing boards meet to confirm and certify the results of the election. A state canvassing board then reviews those findings and meets to confirm and certify election results. Then, Minnesota counties conduct an additional post-election audit. During this process, a sample of precincts and counties is selected to hand count ballots and ensure their equipment worked with perfect accuracy. If an issue arises in that sample, more precincts and counties are tested. But in Minnesota history, every hand-counted sample has verified election results and shown that the equipment did its job. After the certification and audits are complete, the voter records are updated to again ensure voters only cast one ballot. In the rare case a discrepancy is found, local law enforcement are informed and conduct an independent investigation to determine the facts. Over the past 164 years, Minnesotans have worked together to refine and improve our elections processes. Our state will always be committed to free, fair, accurate, and secure elections, and voters know it. We have a lot to be proud of, especially when it comes to voting. Do your part. Register and go vote. Find out how at mnvotes.gov.
Thank you, Paul and David, for giving this presentation. I just want to address a few questions before I move on to the engagement opportunities. First of all, you all are very busy, and same with counties across the state. Are there certain counties that you're aware of that have seen more data process requests since 2020?
I can start with that. So the counties certainly aren't required to notify us when they get the data practices request, but I think it's safe to say all 87 counties have gotten data practices requests. I often get emails asking from one county asking, do you know if other counties have gotten this? And typically I'll get a second email, the exact same request sent to a different county. So yes, I believe all 87 counties are facing that challenge.
Yeah, I can put a 9. Anecdotally, I talked to one county that since the primary election received 40 or more data requests. So it's in some cases, a pretty big number, but we know it's been hit across the state.
Well, we'll make sure that we do what we can to support you and all the election officials in the county level. But a couple more questions are regarding the canvassing board. If there was a chance where they didn't certify the votes, what would happen? And also regarding some of these meetings coming up, are the same processes in place with law enforcement or de-escalation tactics if we attend those?
I know when it comes to the role of the canvassing board as a ministerial function is to review and certify the results of the election. We did see something like this play out in New Mexico, I think, with their primary election, where it's a different composition for their canvassing board, but commissioner there was a couple were deciding not to certify, and they were ultimately compelled by the courts, where a majority ultimately did certify the election. But I think some of that would fall into an area where if a officer or a member of the canvassing board were not doing their statutory duty, then it would involve the courts. Maybe David has more to say to that.
Nothing on that part, but the second part of the question, that's something we recently had a discussion with our federal partners on, that elections don't end on election day. There are the canvassing boards, there are the post-election audits. And so the communication channels we have with our federal partners are going to remain open until the election is fully certified by the state canvassing board, to make sure that if there are security threats against any of the canvassing boards or the post-election audit officials, that we have methods to help deal with that.
All right. Quick question too. If someone doesn't vote for every candidate, is their ballot still accepted?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to move on here to our next steps. At the league, we are planning on getting involved beyond, all of the things that you all are doing already by being election judges, registering people to vote. The next step here is to make sure that we protect democracy for the future. And given our relationships, especially in some of these counties that don't have other people working, you might be on your own out there, and we really need to be supporting the election officials in those areas. And so we've talked and heard today about the post-election audit as an example of a way that we can show up and engage with those who are certifying the results and making sure that they know we trust the process that they're following and that has been trusted in Minnesota for so long. So if you are interested in doing that, always you can send me an email, and I have this here opportunity where you can just click if you're interested in joining our Elections 411 work, which Elections 411 again is everything that you heard today written down and checked by the Secretary of State's, fact checked by them, and we also can answer any questions that you have in the future, either by asking Paul or David. We can send them an email, get you connected, or Paul at the league also has many answers to these questions because he's an election judge and has been involved for a very long time in democracy work. So I guess I just ask you to, if you want to join the Observer Corps. We've obviously we've been doing this model at the state level for a long time, but we really want to do it at the county level now, and then show up to support directly these election efforts, and so that we can continue doing this beyond this election and into the next few years as election judges face more and more pressure. So any ideas that you have are welcome, and thank you so much for joining. Hand it over to Paul Huffman to close us out.
All right, thanks, Sam, and thank you to all our members who participated today. Thank you for taking time to learn more about this important topic of our elections and how we know they're going to be secure and fair, this year. Thank you again to David and Paul for their time and their efforts, both today, but more broadly with leading elections in Minnesota. So this is recorded. It will be available. I think there's a lot of great information you want to revisit. Share this with others in your league. Share it with the members of the public. Because this is just critical to the health of our democracy. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.